It's a real pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to reflect on Shirin's work, and it's been very stimulating having her here and hearing her talk yesterday, and I'm very grateful to her for her work and also the generosity of her presentation yesterday, so thank you. So today my intent is not to present a particular thesis or argument about her work. I don't think I have managed to formulate a position, so to speak, on it or to have an argument. But there are a few questions that I have and points that I hope will be fertile for further discussion. And most of them have to do with the question of beauty, which I think if you look at the writing on Shirin's work is something that has been touched on relatively little compared to other topics, despite the fact that Shirin herself has said that beauty is really central to her work and one of, if not the most important aspects of it. And I have a brief quote of comment of Shirin's from an interview she did in 2002 with David Shapiro. "Beauty has always been a major aspect of my work, partially because it is inherent in the nature of Islamic tradition. It is as essential an aspect of Islamic it is an essential aspect of Islamic spirituality, particularly in the mysticism associated with Islam, such as the Sufi tradition, in which beauty is a fundamental vehicle of meditation with God. We are told, quote, God loves beauty, and therefore so much focus is given to creating beauty. Beauty is a metaphor, is a mediator between human and divine." So aside from, or perhaps better said, in addition to these other issues of content, whether those have to do with gender, power, history, politics, I'm very curious about the aesthetic dimension of her work. So what about her work is beautiful? Where is the beauty in the work? What are her aesthetic criteria? Are there consistent formal approaches that suggest a coherent aesthetic approach? Does her aesthetic relate to or derive from any specific tradition or multiple traditions? So to take these questions in order, what is it about her work that is beautiful? I think that that's actually a very subjective question. I have my own sense of what is beautiful in the work to me, but it's probably not meaningful in this context. So what are her aesthetic criteria? Well, I don't know, but I'm curious to find out. So we'll hopefully have a chance to hear from Shirin herself in a while. I think this is a very interesting question given the central place of beauty in her work, to hear from Shirin herself about what for her is she aspiring to in terms of the beautiful? Are they formal characteristics, qualities of affect, structural conditions? How does she know when she's achieved it? The third question, are there consistent formal approaches that suggest a coherent aesthetic approach? So I would say that I can posit an answer to this question, at least if we focus on a specific body of work. And one of the things which we learned from last night is that in terms of consistency, Shirin is consistently inconsistent. So we really can't look probably across the full spectrum of her work for an answer to this question. But I think if we isolate works from a particular period or of a type, we can find certain consistencies that I think begin to suggest a common aesthetic paradigm. And the three works that I want to talk about specifically, and they've been grouped together in the past, probably because they do share these sort of this through line, are Turbulent, Rapture, and Fervor, which form a kind of a trilogy. And I hope you're all familiar with them at least a little bit, because we're not going to be able to show them here. They are all black and white video installations, and two of them, the first two, are similar in that they require at least in one iteration, a particular spatial relationship between the two screens. The third work, Fervor, differs from this in having the two screens side by side. But Turbulent and Rapture require, in their installation version, that the screens be opposite one another, which creates a particular, to use a term that Shirin used last night, sculptural condition one that incorporates physical space and a kind of phenomenological relation between the viewer and the screens, and indeed between the screens and each other. And this is a very different kind of cinematic space from the one that was theorized by the French film theorists Christian Metz, Baudry, Ballure, and so on. And I return to them in part because I think in some ways they're the theorists that I think have best understood and described the sort of the ideational, cognitive, and psychological and perhaps aesthetic repercussions of the particular formal deployment of what they call the cinematic apparatus. That is not just the content of the film, but the structure of the film experience, the way in which we, in a typical cinema, sit in a chair in a darkened room and look at an image on a screen that's projected from behind us. So there's a whole body of theory in French film theory that looks at what is the significance of that, experientially speaking, of that sort of state of reduced mobility and this big white screen and so on, completely apart from what is on the screen. And I think that Shirin's foray into this space where physical considerations and the considerations of the relationship between the viewer as a physical and perceiving being and the screens, where that becomes very much heightened as part of the perceptual, cognitive, and I would suggest aesthetic experience, that she's clearly thinking about this as one of her tools for instilling some kind of awareness in her viewer, apart from what is actually the content of the films themselves. The mirror placement of the screens underscores a very important theme in her work, which is duality. She said last night many times that dualisms of any kind, really, the essence of reality in a way, I think for her, is duality. Male and female, dark and light, and so on. So in these three works, which thematically are based on the duality of male and female, we also have, as a viewer, this embodied experience of a spatial duality of being placed between two opposite or relating planes. But I also think that although I doubt that, I'm going to be interested to hear from her, that her work is specifically informed by French film theory, I think that there is possibly an analysis yet to be made that gets into kind of the psychoanalytic dimension of her, both the relationship between her formal choices and her thematic choices. French film theory, of course, is very psychoanalytically based and has everything to do with desire and sort of the conditions of emergent sexuality and repression. And this trilogy, of course, is all about a male-female dynamic and about desire and kind of slippages of presence and absence. So there might be something there that I think is more elementally sexually dynamic than culturally specific, as the work has been previously discussed. But what I also, I guess now to my next question, does her aesthetic relate to or derive from any specific tradition or traditions? So she said in the quote that I read at the beginning that it does for her derive specifically from an Islamic mindset. So one of the things I would like to pose as an idea, perhaps for Shirin to address, is whether these installations, which create not only a delineation of a kind of a duality, but also form by implication a kind of a rectilinear space for the viewer, positioned between these two antithetical screens and the implied side screens, that there is somehow perhaps an echo of the classical Persian garden, which we learned last night is in fact an important motif for her thematically in many of the works. In Tuba, in Women Without Men, and so on. The garden is perhaps the most potent metaphor in Islamic and perhaps especially Persian traditions for paradise and for a paradise on earth. So I'm curious to know if one can think of these early works in terms of that kind of implied enclosure and the dynamics that occur within it. I'm also curious about the degree to which not just Persian, but specifically Zoroastrian philosophy and aesthetics inform the work. And Shirin mentioned yesterday in the talk that some of the imagery in the work that she did with Philip Glass, Passages, derived from Zoroastrian symbolism, fire specifically, fire and water being two of the key symbolic features of Zoroastrian mythology or spirituality, both of which frequently appear in her work. Another very important feature of Zoroastrianism, really a defining feature, is its focus on dualism, of a reality divided between good and evil, light and dark, and so on. And so I suspect that Shirin's emphasis on dualism derives in part from this. Of course, the Book of Kings, which is the subject of one of her most recent projects, is a text with, as I understand it, Zoroastrian roots. It comes from a tradition of Zoroastrian literature. And it's also sort of another kind of compelling or perhaps tangential connection. Shirin's repeated use of the word struggle to define her own practice and also the actions and the condition of her protagonists calls to mind sort of Hegel inevitably, and the idea of struggle as a kind of a inherent condition in being, although one doesn't get the sense, or at least I don't, get the sense in Shirin's work that there is a dialectical struggle in her work. The opposites don't necessarily resolve. There's no synthesis. There's antithesis, thesis and antithesis, but no synthesis. But Zoroastrianism played a very important role for Hegel in his aesthetics and philosophy of history as really the grounding culture of humanity. He identified Zoroastrianism as sort of the first historic culture, the beginning, a culture in which first emerged the sort of self-awareness and the possibility of freedom. One more thing I wanted to mention, and I think, as I began to explore this, I just felt that one could go off in lots of different directions, but another interesting reference I found that I think perhaps illuminates a dimension of her work in terms of Islamic aesthetics was a comment of Oliver Lehman in his book on Islamic aesthetics, where he describes the role of the audience in musical performances. And he was specifically talking in the context of a performance of Kalthoum, who, of course, is the subject of Shirin's next film. And he said, to a degree, the audience reacts as it has seen Sufis react, and this is often in a rather wild and free way. Yet in many of the leading writings on this topic, the Sufis stress the significance of remaining quiet and contemplative when listening to music. And if the music and dance throws one into ecstasy, then obviously we might act wildly, but when the stage is over, we should be quiet and still, physically and mentally. As Al-Ghazali puts it in the Ihya Ulum al-Din, it is often the quietest person who achieves the highest degree of ecstasy. So this sort of, again, a kind of a dualism between, a wild performance or wild experience and a quiet contemplative condition, I think is embodied in Rapture, Turbulent, the two performers, the female and the male performer. And this analysis of Islamic aesthetics changes my perspective on the sort of the quality of experience in the male performer when he allows the female to sing. Without knowing this, of the importance of quietness as a kind of ecstasy, I would and did interpret the quietness of the male performer and the male audience as a kind of a resignation, perhaps judgment, a position of judgment or shame in the face of a better performance by the woman. Knowing this interpretation gives me a very different view of their reaction and also of the empty seats in the audience when the female is performing, which is kind of the ultimate embodiment of quiet, absence. So be curious to know what Shirin makes of that. And then lastly, I want to go off in a completely different direction, because I think Shirin's work is not only informed by Islamic and Persian traditions, but her own cultural position is hybrid, obviously. And so I want to close with a quote from Lorca writing about duende, which is an aesthetic that he felt was the aesthetic of the Roma peoples, and with resonance throughout Europe and the Middle East. The duende, where is the duende? Through the empty archway, a wind of the spirit enters, blowing insistently over the heads of the dead in search of new landscapes and unknown accents. A wind with the odor of a child's saliva, crushed grass, and Medusa's veil, announcing the endless baptism of freshly created things. In the garden I shall die, in the rose tree they will kill me. Mother, I went to gather roses, looking for death within the garden. Mother, I went cutting roses, looking for death within the rose tree. In the garden I shall die, in the rose tree they'll kill me. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I also wanted to say that today in this room is Shojo Azari, who's my collaborator and partner, and he should certainly participate because he has a lot to do with all the work that I've done, including the aesthetics of it. So I hope he would not be so passive and come and sit in the front. I just wanted to relate to the issue that you pointed out, the question of beauty, the aesthetic, and all the visual resources. And I have to just be really honest. I think that for me, a lot of these explanations only came a few years after I had already created a body of work where I could have a retrospectum to think, well, where all these aesthetics are coming. So I'm not really sure that I have a real exact theoretical or precise analytical explanation where all these resources come from. But the sense of duality, I think, is that, first of all, I don't think I've ever made a single work that contains this idea of beauty without intersecting the question of disturbance, pain, violence. I think beauty on its own is extremely banal and problematic and decorative. And so, I keep thinking back again, when I looked at the more classic Islamic art and Persian art, I began to see how intuitively, for example, the Persian miniatures are all about this incorporation of text and the image. And I never thought about it, how I've always been working with photography and calligraphy. And then I thought about the Islamic architecture and decorative designs and the abstractions, the symmetry, the harmony, the geometric forms, the element of void, minimalism, repetition. And I look at rapture and this idea of symmetry and repetition and the idea of order within chaos. And so it was then I said, well, maybe over the time that I grew up in Iran, looking at the ceiling with the decorative motifs, the carpet, the architecture, maybe this has been an inherent information. But then I think about where the dark side comes, and I think about the political reality of Iran and the fact that violence, oppression, and pain is an inevitable part of the Iranian modern history. So I think what you see, again, this hybrid of the past and the present, the poetic and the political, and the aesthetic, I think, is informed by perhaps a more classic history of Iran, but the concepts, I would say, are more rooted in contemporary modern Iran, because that's where I belong to. But the visual metaphors, obviously, I think go way back. But having said all of this, I'm not sure if I can really defend it in any analytical sense. It's just that I've been able to look back at my own patterns. And for example, it came to me that woman of Allah, if you think of the single images, there's always this juxtaposition of the female body and then the calligraphy, which is obviously a very sacred and beautiful form of art. But then you have the weapon, always in juxtaposition with the eroticism of the female body and the text and all of that. And then when you think of Woman Without Men, just to give you one example of the shot of the bathhouse, where you had this magnificent Islamic architecture of the bathhouse, almost like the Orientalist paintings, Gérôme's paintings, they say. But then you have an anorexic woman bleeding. Or even the Book of Kings, the Divine Rebellion, this photograph of a person who's been executed, but yet on the legs are this incredible work of illustration of the Book of Kings. So there's always this conflicting ideas that I suppose they're meant to again emphasize the sense of duality that I see. And so I thought your observation was wonderful.
And do you think this has Zoroastrian roots? Because in the Zoroastrian spirituality, my understanding is that order and chaos coexist and are immanent in all things.
The truth is that I'm not really informed about the Zoroastrian beyond the superficiality of what I know, as I was raised in Iran. And so I couldn't, for example, when I made Passage, which was all about the air, the water, the earth, and the fire, the four important aspects of the Zoroastrian tradition, but only after I came to understand it. Or even the tradition of mysticism, which is all to do with this idea of meditation of beauty, yet melancholy, and everything I do has this incredibly melancholic feeling to it, but it's not really depressing. It's about reflection, and only later I thought, well, I've never studied mysticism of any particular literature or Iranian tradition, but is it possible that if you're born to a culture, and this is really important, like I have two people here who are extremely well read in terms of literature and history of Zoroastrians and all of that, but I was never really well studied. I was never well read. So why did I become an artist, and why do my work have this subliminal references to things that I've never really studied deeply? And I'm a little bit, surprised myself. So I don't know. Perhaps other people have.
Yes.
A question about.
Can we have a mic over here? Sorry, if I want to get your voice on the recording for posterity.
I have an observation about history and the use of space in your work. And I was thinking about the ritual celebration and performance of the Muharram battlefield. And I think a lot of your work, especially the trilogy, evokes that, especially with the audience as significant as the performance and the turning around of the audience in the Muharram as well. I wonder if that is a subliminal or deliberate invocation. And number two, I have a question about turbulence in particular. I've studied it a little bit, and I thought about the male performance of the poetry of Rumi. Is that correct? And I do not know the musical score, but it's quite profound. And he is singing to a male audience face on, white shirt, black pants, and then the woman, Susan Daim, is singing a kind of a chaotic, tracked, scat fusion, amazing composition, with her back to an empty audience. One thinks of the invocation of women and maybe that emptiness, I'm not sure, but I don't think of your work as really the encounter of male-female as oppressed oppressor, but more as an abrasion that points to kind of an awakening at different strata of time, in this dream space and in this awakening space that you have at particular moments signified in each of the works.
I mean, together with Shoujo, who was, by the way, the singer in Turbulent, when we started Turbulent, we had a conceptual strategy that everything about the male singer versus the female singer would be about the opposite. The man was a conformist. He sang a traditional song. He had an audience. The camera was stationary. They had white shirts. He was a conformist. Where the woman was a rebellious. She had no audience. When she sang, she broke all the rules of traditional music. and the camera was rotating. And it was to reiterate the differences and to reiterate the fact that ultimately, in my mind, she became victorious because she became very innovative in a way. And I mean, this was a very abstract way of going about it, but it did make a direct reference to the way in which I think women are up against the wall, and because of that, they become more confrontational and therefore more free in strange ways. And so we start with this overall art, but then the work finds its own other complex places that we didn't anticipate, you see. But we have a very clear strategy that is both conceptual and visual. For example, I remember we talked very clearly about the camera. With her, it's much more psychological, about her madness, about the chaos. He was all about order. Everything was fixed, you know. And so, you know, it was the same idea, I believe, about rapture, you know, the woman in nature, and this migration from the desert to the sea. And that was so meaningful in terms of moving, the mobility, the traveling, the taking journey, you know, where the men was fixated just going on a maze of the fortress. And so, you know, again, we never approach an idea intuitively. In other words, everything is really well planned. But at the end, a lot of it ends up becoming intuitive. It's hard to describe. Shoja, you want to say anything about what I'm saying, adding to it?
No, you're saying it very well.
See that?
I really don't know what to add. I think that I think it's something to talk about art and basically analyze it after it's made, and it's something else when you actually are making it. And it's a process that is, of course, you try to prepare yourself. I mean, and the way that we work is that actually we start with an idea. I mean, Shirin starts with an idea, and then we would analyze it to death, basically, you know, talk about it, all the possibilities and everything. And after that, it is just the process itself, and the process changes a lot of things, you know, so you enter the process. And many, many things, you know, are really, like, I think they emerge, especially with her, which I think is really very in tune in some sense, and very her intuition is really, really strong in a very weird way, you know. It's almost ineffable to some extent. It is then it's really like somehow I think it collects it connects to the collective subconscious. I think the images that you're talking about and where they come from, I don't think if they have Zoroastrian roots, I don't think if they have Greek roots, I don't think if they have Chinese root or Indian root. I think it has human roots, basically, and it's that mythology that we all share, and that's why it enters a universal level, basically. I think that the dawn of humanity, all of us, basically, I mean, if you look at the Book of Kings, for example, and the tragedies of the Book of Kings, and the mythology of the Persian mythology, which is very much pre-Zoroastrian, you know, I mean, that's the core of the mythology is pre-Zoroastrian. I would say that with Zoroastrianism, everything starts to go south, you know, and it ends with Christian duality and then later Western dualism. But anyway, so it's pre-Zoroastrian, and also, like, I think it has roots in, you could find its roots in Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology and whatnot. So it's, I think they're very much like the images that we carry in our collective subconscious.
One thing
and somehow this woman is in tune to it, you know, and that's the bizarre thing about art, you know.
One of the things I realized that this latest work that we might show you, which is a work in progress, I'm having a very hard time explaining to people what it's about. And I realized that only after I've made a work, I can really speak about it. And this work particularly, because it's not political at all, every time I try to show it, slides of it, and try to explain what the meaning is, I have a very hard time explaining it. And I think in a year maybe I could, but at the moment.
Well, we should move on to our, I think, Jeff
Thank you for all coming, and maybe we'll shift gears a little bit here. I have my own agenda, which is that although Shirin's largely known as an art world figure, as a filmmaker and film historian, I'm claiming Shirin for the cinema. And Hollywood can have Catherine Bigelow and Quentin Tarantino, and the mainstream media can debate the value of their films. But for those of us interested in a cinema that is living up to its radical aspiration of a poetic and political medium that can engage the deepest and most crucial questions of our time, and perhaps even cause us to think differently, it's the work of visual artists today who are not trained in the ways of the industrial cinema and its schools that are moving the art of cinema into new realms of experience. In the last decade or so, the most exciting and serious films, feature films being made, have not been the filmmakers trained in the techniques, forms, and histories of cinema, but rather artists who have been gravitating to film through their work as visual artists, not hung up by the idea of the correct way of making films, the right narrative techniques, the right script forms, formal conventions, etc. Shirin, along with other artists such as Apichatpong Weerasethakul, who made Uncle Bunmi, who can recall his past lives, Julian Schnabel, who made The Diving Bell and The Butterfly, Steve McQueen, who made Hunger, are revitalizing the feature film form through a re-engagement with the visual image. Their concern with form that allows for poetic metaphor, symbolism, abstraction, and allegory to return to the feature film. They've arrived at a cinema with such a sophisticated understanding of visual form and the ways images make meaning that the films, even their first feature films, have a sureness and virtuosity that's rare in the early moments of filmmakers' careers. Rather than tired cliches of film form or the tongue-in-cheek referentiality of film history, it seems that it seems to constitute much contemporary feature filmmaking. In these artists' films, we find a freshness of invention that evokes the excitement of the heyday of cinematic invention from Europe and Russia in the 1920s to the new waves of the post-war period to the third cinemas of the 60s and 70s. And it's no wonder that Shirin and Apichatpong and Steve McQueen are winning the grand awards of the big film festivals that I think people are sensing a form of invention. So I want to talk a little bit more and add to some of the things that Larry was saying about the installations and then open it up. But I thought we should see a little film work. And in this claiming of Shirin for cinema, it's also important to place her films in the context of the history of women's cinema. Not just the handful of Hollywood filmmakers who were allowed into the industry guild, but the incredibly rich history of women artists and filmmakers making experimental films and inventing a new language for cinema, from Germaine Dulac in the 20s to Maya Deren in the 40s, to Agnes Varda, to Farouk Farrokhzad in the 60s, Marguerite Duras, Chantal Akerman, Sarah Gomez, Sue Friedrich in the 70s and beyond. I see Shirin's work very much a part of this history of invention. And it's so extraordinary to see in this work the way in which Shirin pays homage to Maya Deren. And we can see how Shirin is sowing a similar path to Deren, bringing elements of the lyrical cinema and the psychodrama that Deren pioneered into her current work. The psychodrama, I think, is a really interesting genre in some ways that was very specific to the 1940s and 50s, that in some, I think, very interesting and much more politicized ways that Shirin is working with in her films. The psychodrama, of course, is this, particularly in relation to Darren, about the blurring of subjective experience and internal experience with the external world, and the ways in which the inner and outer experience are not levels of reality, but a continuous one as well. And I think that we see this in some of the films, the installation work, but more profoundly in the feature film Women Without Men. And it's wonderful to see this as well. Darren famously formulated her theory of cinema and in terms of vertical and horizontal forms of narrative cinema. And maybe it's a helpful way of thinking about the whole question of the poetic in cinema. It's a kind of simple formulation that for Darren, the horizontal plane is sort of the narrative plane, the emplotment, the way in which action moves from one thing to the next, the way in which character is developed. And the vertical plane is a kind of depth axis, the way she defined it, bringing forth the ways a particular moment or situation or image is experienced or feels, how meaning accrues over time. In Darren's terms, that's the poetic experience of cinema that one rarely can describe, but feels intensely. So it's those moments of connection, as a phenomenon of the present with the cinematic image. And so one is not carried off and away, but brought closer to the experience of the present moment of the viewing. And for many, this vertical plane is where the art of cinema lies, and we associate this with some of the great film poets such as Dreyer and Bresson, Tarkovsky, Brakhage, and Kiarostami. For Shirin, the vertical plane, I think, is at the center of her most radical work. Her film installations in which emplotment is nearly non-existent, but it's through the rich visualization and attention to formal concerns of composition, color, the construction of space, movement, stasis, and sound that gives the viewer access to the complex associations and implications of the social and gender relations that these films explore. Another point that I think is quite significant is that as Shirin moved into image making in the early 90s, she and Soji as well re-engaged the film medium and cinematic forms at the very moment that cinema is transforming into an electronic medium. In the art world, video art and installation were using the image, using a kind of anti-aesthetic vocabulary of video art and television. Much of that work was language-based, and so I found it extraordinary when these installations appeared that they were using film and the kinds of forms and techniques that we associated most with cinema. And of course, this culminates in the first feature film, Women Without Men. And in this film, they return to the horizontal plane of character-driven emplotment, but the vertical remains at the center of the film, through the complex and layered use of cinematic time. And I think this is something I would love to talk more about, is the ways in which Women Without Men becomes a medium through which the filmmakers evoke the history of modern Iran, both through historical recreation and the allegorical forms that bring back the specter of both the 1979 and 2009 revolution. The film begins following the lives of 3 women in the film, but then becomes increasingly atemporal as it attempts to engage the experience of the national trauma of Iran, structured around the coup that overthrew Mossadegh and led to the installation of the Shah in 1953. The film becomes temporally unhinged, mixing historical events with subjective perception, fantasy, desire, and imaginings. The film at once retrieves a lost image of the history of Iran as a secular society, and it envisions the strength and solidarity of Iranian women across history. While Shirin has used the more literary term magical realism to describe the temporality of the film, I see it as cinematic time, in which the plasticity of the medium allows for the multiplicity of temporalities to emerge. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze has described the time image as one that allows both the actual and the virtual of the image to be experienced. That is, what is actually seen in the image is a figuration of the moment of time represented in the film, and what can be imagined and experienced in other ways. In Women Without Men, time surrounds the images, and it's through this that they accrue their meanings. And so by the end of the film, we're moving through many layers of time, not just the ones that are experienced, are dramatized in the film, but the way in which the history of Iran reverberates across the film and through us as well. And so I think I'll stop there, but to try to raise this question of how you were thinking about time in relation to both history and this idea of cinematic time.
I hope that Shoja would have some input, because he was the reason I moved towards cinema from video. I would say that the first time I realized that I am shifting from visual art to cinema is when I realized that there's beginning to have a psychological depth in the characters. I remember from Rapture and Turbulent and Fervor, where the people were used more or less like sculptures. They were statues. They were devoid of humanity. They were more like representative of a culture. In fact, in Rapture, if you notice, there's never a time that the camera comes to a close-up. The camera is only on groups versus groups. So you never have a protagonist. You never have a character. It was never about the inner world of that character. It was about the world outside. And I think when I look back at this piece that I just showed you, it shows the shift where I do interest. It does interest me now to go in the inner lives of the people. And I think that's very cinematic. And I think even my photographs have become more narrative, more character-based. The Book of Kings, I think there's much more psychological aspect to the characters. In terms of time, again, I'm going back to this duality. I'm so grounded on emotionality and timelessness, and some things very primal, some things very existential issues, and yet the reality can escape me, history, political reality. So, like you said, with The Woman Without Men, this question of where time ends and where it begins. In the orchard, time stops, literally. And I think intentionally, even the camera movement were very slow, very hypnotic. We even incorporated mist and elements that just the viewer suddenly, as you entered the space between the sound, the camera movement, and the visual display, you really felt like you just left the world behind this wall, and you've literally entered another universe. Where we are back into the city, you're immediately caught with time, realistic sounds, conversations that are, dialogues that are very believable. So this interests me only because I find that I'm constantly navigating between the emotional, the primal, the personal versus the social, political, and historical. And so somehow they these concepts finding their ways visually and sonically in the way to convey to the audience that now we're in Iran, but now we're not, now we're talking about Iranian history, but now we're not. We're talking about humanity. And so how to navigate these ideas to, again, thinking about the audience, how they could experience that so fully. It makes the composer to understand this idea, the cinematographer, the production designer, the narrative that is written, to help them feel this travel back and forth between time, between spaces, and I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but it's in every work that we create, there is this ephemeral aspect, there is this universality, and yet always the reminder of reality. I don't know if Shoujo wants to add anything to this.
Soji, do you want to say something, or?
No, I'd rather really hear
Okay.
from you.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
you had your hand.
Hi, Eid al-Shama Mubarak.
It's our New Year's.
It's the Persian New Year's today. And it's funny you talk about Zoroastrian tradition, because that is something rooted in Zoroastrianism. And actually, even the Zoroastrian conversation got me thinking before this about how political everything really is for me as an Iranian American, and as someone who's in exile and who's born in Iran. I can only imagine that's even more for you. I remember reading in an interview when you said all art is political for an exile, and you don't have sort of the luxury to separate politicality from art. And I think that's something really unique to art from people who are living in exile, especially with Iran. So I'm interested to see, even with this new work that you're working on, which isn't maybe as overtly political as your other work, are you still constantly thinking about political themes, or are you departing from that?
Well, I think I would be very eager to know your interpretation about the work. Like I said, it's like this particular work, I think it's very personal. And the personal for me is also very political, because I think it's about a dream. It's really about an anxiety about the space of abyss, like I mentioned yesterday. And I think very often I feel like that I'm just really falling and trying to... And this extreme overexposed space in the exterior by the beach, extreme dark space inside of the mansion was intentional, to represent the idea that, we come from one side, you go to the other, but afterwards you want to just come back to, and it's like this passage, this tunnel, and very often I find life is a struggle. It's about the attempt to survive, the idea of finding a way to come back up. Again, I can't find the words to explain it. But it's definitely driven from something very personal. So I actually like to hear other people's, to me this piece is quite abstract. And I'm wondering if anybody got anything out of it, or was that terribly, I would really like to know the reaction.
I wanted to say that I think it is very much like dream life. That sense of anxious wandering that doesn't seem to result in any real sense of arrival, and for a long time no real event. And then finally, when there is an event, that's it. You have to be out of that environment. There's the wake up moment on the beach. And that group of people that was very vague, that seemed to be gathered for some reason, but one couldn't quite tell what. All of that, to me, was very reminiscent of my own dream life, and I imagine probably other people as well. That's a universal quality.
Are there any more? Maybe we should move on? I have two. Oh, okay.
I was struck with the feeling of Tarkovsky in some of this, and his work in terms of memory and in terms of kind of a science fiction sort of landscape that goes back to a historical memory in Russia, especially in the Mirror and Nostalgie. And it would be silly for me to make a comparison between your work and his, because I think they're very different intentions. But when you go into that kind of memory dream space and film it, what kinds of things are you looking for?
I think there's no logic in a dream, and I was looking for something that there's no logic. The progression, there's the ambiguity, and very often when you have dreams and you think back, you have no maybe you have no. I dream a lot, and they're pretty surreal, and I write them down because I don't quite understand the reason for certain, but I love the illogical progression in a dream. And I think in this film, I was thinking of that, yeah.
So something that struck me about this last piece is that when the images start getting blurry, you get a sense that you're seeing from the point of view of the character. But then there's this other scene where you realize the character is also in the blurry scene. So there's this third point of view, or this other point of view where you can see everything unfolding, which is as if it's a priori there, right? It's something that is watching. And then there is the character in this blurry world confronts a collectivity. There is a group of people that she confronts, right? And then and she has a very tenuous relationship to this group of people, which she's also part of. So there's this becoming responsible and being asked to reckon with a collectivity within the space of dream that is absent from the clear waking life that you also depict. That's all
great.
I want to say.
I know you had something.
I was just going to say that, I mean, one of the things about the psychodrama is that this distinctions between waking and dream life and real and subjective and so on become blurred, and they're not sort of turned into hierarchy in a way. And so one is confronted with the sort of enfoldment of them together, and that's something. And your film, is really doing that, and so it demands a different kind of way of approaching story and narrative in that way.
I know we have to move on.
One more question. Well, I have so many different associations. When Larry, when you started, I was thinking of Louis Armstrong saying, if you have to ask what jazz is, you won't, know what jazz is, that kind of thing. And I was also reminded of an experience of living close to an elderly Japanese woman who had studied tea ceremony, and the garden club of Taos, New Mexico, had forgotten their camera, so they wanted her to just pose for some photographs, and she couldn't do that. She could only do the whole ceremony again. So she couldn't separate out a part from a whole, and that's what I experience with your work. It's so the analytic doesn't, mean anything, but rather it's almost like post-Jung. We talk about Hillman's work. James Hillman said it's not the symbol of something; it is the image itself. So I think of Chris Marker. I think of even Wim Wenders's last film, Palermo Shooting, where he said that he went to Palermo because he didn't know what kind of film he wanted to make. And then he wandered into a chapel and he saw a painting. And then he proceeded to follow that painting. And he saw another small portrait of a woman, and he looked for an actress who looked like that portrait. He allowed his own passage, his own travels, to dictate the content of the film, Palermo Shooting, which unfortunately hasn't even been distributed in the United States. If you miss it at a festival, I happened to see it at a festival, and then you never see it here. So we have so much cultural imperialism, in this country that we don't even get to see films. So I just, I was jotting down all of my associations, and they're just so numerous. The work of Bill Viola, I feel in your work, and many things which may not even be related, but it's just a direct experience. For me, the ocean cinematography in that 10 minutes was extraordinary. We've seen many, many films of ocean, but this was very distinct. So that's my comments.
Thank you. No, we have to move on. There is too little time. Afterwards, there will be more questions. Yeah. Actually, in relation to to the film you just showed, I was wondering whether your films dream each other from one to the next, because there are scenes in Women Without Men that announce some of the scenes in this film, and the emergence of the double, and this borderline in the experience of madness that is possibly transforming into an imaginal experience, possibly taking completely astray. So it's actually seems that there are, maybe I will point out a couple of scenes in Women Without Men, particularly with Pfizer, when she's running in the forest, right? So I wanted to begin by addressing the question of the exilic position that Shirin raised last time and in many of the interviews that she's given, and that it seems to be treated as a biographical fact. And I wanted to suggest and try to see it instead as an ontological fact and also an existential fact, as you just said, something that has to do with the status of images themselves and as being out of the world. And your position as a channel, as you suggested, right? What does it mean to channel without really realizing the way in which this happened, in almost a kind of shamanic way, right? A culture and religious tradition that it can go beyond its own form of life and encounter absolute spirit, as Arthur Danto says in an essay that he wrote about your work. And you also described in some of your interviews, and again last night, you mentioned the fact that the videos and in general your art has been for you a way of relating to a world from which you had been severed, the revolution, the Iranian revolution not lived. And what did it mean for you in 1990 to go back to Iran and imagine the unlived revolution? I have a friend who was in prison from 1980 to 1989, and she missed the aftermath of the revolution somewhat in the same way, and she wrote a book as an attempt, reckoning through the experience of prison, to re-encounter the revolution, somewhat paradoxically in a similar way. And in fact, I would be interested in seeing some parallels there. You dedicate Women Without Men to all of the people who have died as an address to the dead. And she also does in her work. Her name is Shara Talebi. And I think there are some parallels in this attempt of speaking from beyond the position of having been severed and from a tradition, and at the same time, the fact, which is perhaps a paradox, perhaps not, that this severance is fundamentally necessary, the fact of having been cut off, visually cut off, to be able to renew the conditions of encounter. And without severance, without that ontological severance, there wouldn't be the images of your films. So the images, in some sense, and the installations are intercessors. This is, someone talked about Deleuze, but maybe in a more fundamental sense, even than Deleuze, they are symbols. You talk about the fact that your work is symbolic, is allegorical, mythological, and I want to try to address the status of that. So I would like to move on to the opening shot of Women Without Men. Maybe we can see it afterwards, right? Because I will describe it. I don't know, many of you have seen it. It's available on Netflix. And so I will go on, and maybe at the end, if there is a little time, we can see it. It is a shot framed downward. It registers a falling. There is also a flight, a passage, and passage is also the title of another installation that you made that has to do with a funeral on the beach, between different modalities of existence. So the passage across the severance. Muniz, who was one of the 4 women characters, commits suicide, a suicide that has in the film the character of what I want to read as a shahadat, which could be translated as martyrdom, but also means testimony, transfiguration, and it has the status of a gift, engendering an imaginal space where then the film will unfold. In her passage through death, Muniz becomes an image and delivers the gaze by which the other characters, as well as ourselves, the spectators, will become able to see. To see with new eyes was what Kiarostami in an interview called borrowed eyes. At once eyes of this world and eyes that are not of this world. In a later scene when Muniz then is resurrected, and the status of this resurrection is very ambiguous in the film, as an imaginal form, we could say an angel, an imaginal form of life. She's shown in the midst of a political demonstration in Tehran in support of Mossadegh during the uprisings against the British that preceded the 1953 coup. Her voice-off, which is not hers because it's an impersonal voice, says, "Standing among these hands and faces, I knew that the will that moves all things had come back to me, not to watch, but to see, to act." So then, I want to sort of echo this, perhaps in a scandalous way, with a quote from Ali Shariati in his essay on Shahadat. Actually, in his essay called A Discussion of Shahid, where he's also talking about vision. And Shariati is an Iranian theologian who died just prior to the revolution. It was very important for the Iranian youth at the time, during the fervor that prepared the revolution. Shariati writes, "For the eyes which can no longer read the truth and cannot see the face of the truth in the darkness of despotism and istihmar, all they see being nothing but pollution, the blood of the Shahid is a candlelight which gives vision, and serves us as the radiant light of guidance
for the misguided who wander amidst the homeless caravan. It is a symbol of that which must exist. And then in another place he says that the Shahid bears witness to the disaster, becomes an image, an idea which as such is a form of a memory that persists. So at the outset, the film then is a meditation on the living, on history and memory from a space of death and imagination, a realm of the limit. In the Islamic, Arabic, and Persian tradition of the image, that realm has a name. It has a figure and a concept. It is barzakh. Barzakh is at once the realm of the limit, the line and the isthmus that separates and joins, and the intermediate world of imagination and semblances, what in Arabic is called alam al-mithal, the world of suspended images, a realm that stands between sensory experience and the manifestation of the divine. It's a region of the boundary and a domain of imagination in which contraries come together. Bodies are spiritualized and spirits become manifest in corporeal form. And Shirin kept talking about contradiction last night and paradox, and I kept wondering that the question of the dual structure, even of the framing, even the two screens, could actually be read this way. So a partition, a bar, or a barrier, a curtain, as in fervor, an isthmus between two states or things, two modalities of being, an imaginal barrier connecting yet separating, a bridge at once being and not being, spiritual and corporeal, widening and delimiting the world, this world and the other world in this world. The place of states in which the soul waits after death and before judgment, that is also a barzakh. The realm of suspended images, of being withheld as an image, flying like Muniz. The site where the impossible can manifest itself in concrete form, says Ibn Arabi. I'll just read a couple of lines of this. So this is a quote from Ibn Arabi about the concept of barzakh. A barzakh is something that separates two other things while never going to one side. As for example, the line that separates shadows from sunlight. God says, and this is a quote from the Quran, He let forth the two seas that meet together, between them a barzakh, they do not overpass. The barrier is also the limit, the bar between life and death and judgment. Again, another quote from the barzakh that Ibn Arabi includes, before them is a barzakh till the day they are raised up. And for Ibn Arabi, there is nothing in existence but barzakh, because existence is the arrangement of one thing in between two other things, and existence has no edges. In the barzakh of imagination, the impossible manifests in concrete forms. And for this reason, Ibn Arabi says, the temporality of imagination, which is also cinematic time here, is the temporality of the hereafter. So we see Muniz lost in thoughts, turning her back to us. We see her dancing slow motion with the air. We see her detaching herself from herself, then flying. As her back veil descends on the ground and forms a shape that will announce the many clothed shapes of veils and gowns in the film, and there is a whole vocabulary of this. The most beautiful perhaps being the one in the swimming pool in the scene of the resurrection. She exits the frame, and clouds are cast over. The sun, the source of light from behind, is above, and the movement of the clouds carry us, the viewers. The voice of repeats sukut, silence, quiet, and the freedom of release. The camera slowly descends into the world of vegetation, as if descending on Earth from outer space. The close-up of vegetation blurs closeness and distance, details of the ground, little plants, with the planet seen from afar, macrocosm and microcosm, inside and outside. We have entered the barzakh. Clouds turn into water, rhyme with water, and the camera follows the water stream. We are carried along with the water as if flowing inside our own bodies. Shirin Neshat spoke yesterday the importance of nature and its association with femininity in her film. As we enter the orchard, the garden, the barzakh, we are, however, simultaneously moving in an imaginal world, which is not just nature as we usually understand it, but a visionary geography that rests at once on the material world of objects in historical reality and on the autonomous ontological status of images at khayal al-munfasil in Arabic, the discontinuous imagination, a parallel world that exists independently of the viewer. Shirin Neshat told us yesterday about, this was a repetition in my printout. The concluding frames of the film circle back to the beginning, but in an inverted form. The camera follows Fakhri, the other character, who's the mother of the garden. After the death of Zareen, who was also a character who spiritualizes herself by becoming an anorexic, whose body slowly disappeared and is scrubbed away in a different kind of martyrological image, which is a bloody one. And Fakhri walks out of the house and into the orchard, following the lines of the trees. The camera moves up into the clouds, back into the clouds of the opening shot. We then see Munis again, but now facing us, as if now we're capable of facing her, slowly descending into the ground. As she falls, the gaze carries us beyond, and we depart with the gaze. Perhaps we see ourselves cut off, suspended through the same gaze as Munis, at once exiled from ourselves and made capable to encounter others in the barzakh of existence. Munis's voiceover at the end of the film says, "Death is not so hard, we only think it is. All that we wanted is to find a new form, Rahi Jadid." So, there is no time to say all of the things that I wanted to say, but the most important question, perhaps, is what does it mean to found a Rahi Jadid? So, and in what sense, what does it mean to be able to produce a new form through a visual image that has an ontological status and a status that concerns beauty, but has to pass through the experience of detachment, of being suspended outside of being, and the experience of death, even though here death open up a whole world. And in what sense that kind of gaze, which is the gaze that is cultivated in the film, the gaze through which that teaches us how to be able to see again, and to some extent ourselves performing a shahadat with our vision, it's also a political gaze. And in what sense the constant juxtaposition and counterpoint of the two worlds, the world of the parallel images, the world of the barzakh, the world of this other reality, which is a reality in which, as Ibn Arabi says, meanings pass through dreaming. Sleep and dreaming are the experience through which meanings pass, and the passing of meanings is the possibility of something of non-sensory, of a form of non-sensory knowledge that is associated with divine experience to be able to manifest itself at the level of sensory knowledge. So how is this then related to the possibility of thinking revolution and to the way in which the film being dedicated to the multiple revolutions of not just the Iranian people, but also the revolutions, as you mentioned last night, in the rest of the Middle East? In what sense that kind of gaze and the possibility of seeing is important? I want to make two very quick points that connect this question of the withheld existence in what I call the world of imagination, and also in Islamic tradition, to the use of the turning of the figure in your installation. So as we see Muniz giving her back to us in the opening shot, we see also characters giving their back to us in Turbulent, and in a different way also in Rapture. And in Turbulent, we have the voice performing the role of the flight, I suppose, in the scene of Muniz. And the voice of the song is offered in the movement of withdrawal, turning once back to the world, the lament of the woman who's sinking, the empty theater, the spectral voice, take us beyond the human in a space of mourning, which is in the experience of the imaginary reality, the possibility of bearing witness to a condensation of collective pathos. And in this voice beyond, then we re-encounter this voice beyond in the murmur of the chorus of women in Rapture. And in the last scene of Rapture, the Safar, the departure of the boat, we have again the women turning their back to us and to the man, or looking back, or looking at the world from that anamorphic point of vision, which is the point in which a different kind of gaze can emerge. And then I was thinking, I mean, there is a lot that could be said about what kind of gaze that is, but at the same time I was thinking about what does it mean to be able to represent the experience of trauma, the experience of massacres. I was thinking, watching that scene, about some lines of Jean Genet in his writings on Shatila, and the possibility of photographing the corpses, and what does it mean to be able to go towards them and withdraw from the world in order to be able to see. And so this is about the question of looking back, and its possible political dimensions, political in Alam al-Mital. And then the last point that I wanted to make, but that in part I already made, is about the way the question of desire and transgression are permeating your films. And that in many of the essays that I've read about your work, the question of desire is understood as the prohibition of desire, and in a quite literal sense. And it seems to me that if we want to take seriously the fact that the dimension of the visual takes us at another level of reality, then the curtain, the relationship of the visible and the invisible, and the counterpoint between the masculine and the feminine voice, particularly in Fervor, where the Quranic chapter of the Quran about the story of the prophet Yusuf, who was the dream interpreter, was vision, is recited as a backdrop to this. There is a curtain that divides women and men, and there is a man giving the back to the camera, who was preaching or giving a sermon and lecturing about this chapter of the Quran, telling a story that is read in this kind of dance of the feminine and the masculine, as a story of desire that is also the story of the soul itself. So on this question of the dance of the soul, I conclude. So I think we have a little bit of time.
Do you have? I don't. I just rather, like Shoji said, I've heard myself speak so much that maybe other people have comments. I just want to mention that throughout these few years that we went about making Women Without Men, we took a lot of time analyzing our intention. For example, who each character represented and what was their transformation, etc. And also, for example, Muniz to us was more of a political metaphor, as someone who represented not just a woman but the country, where Zarin became more of a spiritual metaphor that really had nothing to do with the country. And also that the orchard was a place that had its own history. And if you remember when the woman went the first time, there was a photograph of another woman who may have inhabited that place. So the orchard, it was a little bit like the Garden of Eden, a place that welcomed you to have a place of refuge, but it was very punitive if you committed sin. And so this was a place where it gave time out to the woman, but it was also very haunting and punitive. And the city of Tehran, or the country of Iran, was also a place that its history repeated itself. This idea of innocence and rebellion against the people of power, but then over and over again being invaded by various types, and then turmoils, revolutions, and then back again. So it was all about the question of resurrection, and each space having its own type of repeated histories. And I mean, endless amount of conversation. I think we spent 2 good years just discussing the script and stuff, so that would take a long time. We have about 5 minutes, so I'd rather leave this now to other ideas or questions.
Well, I have, it's not really a question, but this figure that you pointed to as part of your discussion that appears frequently in Shirin's work that turns her back or his back, and the sense of, for me anyway, of perhaps the figure admitting an impossibility of meaning, that there's a foreclosure and a distancing or a separateness, that the figure is sort of resigning in a way, and the suggestion being that meaning somehow exceeds the capacity of whatever that person to express. Just was revisiting Hegel in preparation for this, and this is actually the sort of the trope that he assigns to the stage after the Zoroastrian, and a stage on the road to a division of the spirit from an immanent condition to a transcendent condition, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
What I thought was, I was not thinking Hegel when I was pointing out to this. It was really like really seeing it's part of your vocabulary. Really, I think it's something that is formally very meaningful in the videos that I've seen, and that I think points to this. I mean, if I want to follow seriously the idea that there are parallel worlds in this visual work, then one way, one has to be able to open up to the possibility of entering parallel worlds. And I think that the turning, which is something that we find in Buñuel, I mean, we find it in the Exterminating Angel,
So
for instance, right? It's the turning has something to do with this.
So it's a pivot, not a refusal. It's not a refusal, it's a turning to
This is not how I saw it. I saw it as the turning that by, okay, I can give you Hegel then, I mean, yeah, I was thinking Antigone. So I was thinking Antigone's lament, and the moment in which Antigone can sing is the moment where she has turned her back to dunya and to the world, and to the world as the world of everyday, of the historical world, and she is speaking to the dead. So that this turn, so if there is a gaze, if the political stakes of those videos that are apparently so non-political, and yet to me they're profoundly political, has to do with the cultivation of a gaze that becomes capable of seeing when we no longer are capable of seeing, which is what the youth were saying in Tahrir Square. I mean, this is what, it can be discussed very philosophically, but it also can be discussed in a very simple way. What does it mean to be able to see again? And I think this is what some of the videos do. At least, this is only on from.
Yeah.
And when you say parallel world, is that different from a kind of virtual?
But there are those who have
same?
actually attempted to read Alam al-Mital in Arab tradition, with Paul Virilio and the whole question of the simulacrum. And in fact, there is, for instance, there is a video and artist, writer, filmmaker, his name is Jalal Tawfiq, who is Lebanese, Iraqi, and the themes on which you work are actually somewhat related, and the whole possibility of resurrecting a tradition, of connecting to a tradition that has been withdrawn because of what he calls a surpassing disaster, opens up the whole question of what is the status of the image in a world in which the image is at the same time possibly capable of resurrecting, as you were suggesting, she is resurrecting cinema, right? And but also open up to a different kind of, to the realm of the false. So to the realm of the false. So open up to a play of doubles that has a lot to do to the experience of madness, I suppose, also in this film, in which the co-presence of the possibility of truth and the truthfulness of resurrection and the gaze in a world in which the disaster has made us unable to discern. So yeah, in that sense, also virtual reality. Yeah. I don't know what you, Shirin, think. What were you saying?
No, I'm really enjoying your interpretation. It's fascinating because, when an artist makes the work and then other people have their own reading, you tend to learn from it yourself because, again, I never think theoretically, and I am not really aware of the references that I'm influenced by. And so I'm just really enjoying to hear your references and interpretation, really.
Yeah, there's one question.
I just had one quick, sort of comment or question, however it's taken, but there was when Millard was asking or mentioning what he had thought was interesting about the gazes, and the one that was clear, then the one that was a bit cloudy, and then that seemed to be two gazes, but then the origin of the one gaze seemed to be then inside, and that kind of, I found quite interesting this idea of the dream, that perhaps one character of it as a figure to think of it, and a comment was made about the consistently inconsistent, the work. But this kind of, something interesting about the idea of trying to give a form to the kind of multiplication of this kind of inconsistency, and where, it doesn't arise as a paradox, but the paradox arises as having a specific form, which gives rise to a certain kind of movement. Because I was wondering, can you think of if the each work is the dream of another, as Professor Pandolfo had asked at the beginning, is there a way to think of a way to analyze these kinds of works, or a way to think of the politics, if one wants to say, of these works as, are there certain dreams that cannot dream each other? I was just thinking automatically of a film like, I forget what this film was. It was a famous film in which there were dreams within dreams, and no one could, Inception, yeah. And how that, the structure of that dream is to always find, what is the referent, this kind of obsession with the referent, which will determine, the metric and the scale, and that's the way out, and then a misdirection around that, as opposed to this kind of way in which, the gaze is a very different kind of, figure to organize that confusion of the dream. But I don't know, this is just something I thought in listening and seeing the very nice, your in-progress kind of work.
Yeah, just in making this short film, we clearly shot the blurry shot that it would be her point of view, and when we're not on her point of view, it would not be blurry. But there are times that she entered her point of view, so we also allowed that. But I have to say that this has been a lot of debate because there's been some inconsistencies, and that's what the editing has been. And what you were talking to me, often in all abstractions, my idea is that you have to be very concise. You can be abstract and ambiguous as you want, and your logic could be illogical as you want, but you cannot, you have to be very concise about that abstraction. And I think that's about and so with the audience and the question of confusion and fragmentation, and ultimately, I think the works that are very successful that I've done are the ones that within their abstraction, they're very concise, and everyone can walk out with different interpretations. The work that don't do well is a confused vision, is not concise, and sometimes from inception, the idea is confused, so there's nothing you can do in the editing room. But sometimes there are things you could do, the editing. For example, The Woman Without Men, the way we wrote the script and the way it was edited is a world different. We never thought we were going to have voiceover. And the question of comprehension of all these things that we had discussed, meanings and references and symbolism and allegory, suddenly it was just all too much information, and very possible that the people wouldn't even get the allegory of the orchard and the city and this path, and it was just too much of a demand from the audience, conceptually, narratively, allegorically, and all of that. So we, together with Shoja, went back and back. We edited for 2 years and redefined the film in a way to make the film as concise as we could be, but still I don't think we succeeded. I think there are times we lose because there's this, they say you can, make a good script into a bad film, but you cannot make a bad script into a good film. It's not, it doesn't fail completely, but I could see the flaws because, we weren't able to be altogether concise. There's nothing the editing room could do. So these are the challenges, I think, as people like us whose ideas are so out there, but you are looking for an idea of cohesion. So we, at the end, have the audience leave with some idea of meaning and comprehension. And that's hard to arrive. And I think this is why it takes a long time to make a work, for me at least. We shot this video a year ago in March, and we're still editing. And it's 10 minutes, I mean, we're not working on it every day, but we put it away, we bring it back, we look at it. And I think that's the only way,
I'm sort of a little confused about what you mean by concise. What is the concision that you're trying to...
For example, if I could just speak about this one piece, it was very, very clear to me that she was in the exterior, she followed, something happened here, and she was out. There was no way that I'm going to mix up the story in a way that, she's here and having flashbacks. It was extremely important for me that I had a beginning, middle, and the end in terms of the transformation that she was going to travel, This was my arc, that this woman found herself in this state of disillusion and sort of falling apart. She had this experience, and that experience took her to the absolute bottom of whatever her nightmare was. And by reaching the bottom, she was able to come out. This was for me the progression. Now, what really happened in terms of the development in the beach, the way things were falling apart, the way that man appeared, that emerged, to the way that we told the story about the interior, the progression, and how it became increasingly problematic for her, and the way that we could get her out. We had 2 days of shooting. We were limited to the footage. And so other people said, oh no, but you can say the story this way and that way. I said, absolutely not. For me, this has to be this way. And I remember talking with Shoja because he said, well, I could see this tapestry could work out this way and that way. And I never saw it like that. But outside of that, you could tell the story at the beginning different ways. And it's hard to describe. A lot of it is just your gut reaction. But I'm still trying to find it where, yeah, sure, people could walk out of the room and interpret it totally different. But still, there is a clarity in there. I don't find the words to say it, that I have to work in getting it, where I just know it's there, you know. With Rapture, I think it works. With Fervor, it didn't. It got confused at some point. I could just go on about my work, which ones I sort of failed, you know, in that clarity. I think there's one more question.
Yeah.
An ignorant mathematics student, I just saw, and also as an Iranian who's into poetry. So in your work, I just noticed in this last work that we saw, the lady went into the sea, into the ocean. Also in Turbulent, there was a moment that a group of women just went in the sea. That very much reminds me of Rumi's work in some sense, especially very precisely that poetry that says that we are from the sea and we go into the sea. So I'm not sure if my naive translation is the nice one. There were lots of other moments that I see this, or I can imagine that there might be some connection to Rumi's poetry. So was there such a background or mentality when you were making it?
Not at all, actually. I think it's more for Shoja, who has become... yeah, Shoja, you could say a few words, because with Turbulent, Shoja and I searched for the right song, and it was his suggestion to use Yod Gara Dust, which is a poem by Rumi. And then I just made another video that we used. Again, was the musician who chose it. I'm very illiterate. I haven't, and I want to be really honest with you, I'm not really well read. Of course, I know a bit, but I think a lot of it is the influences and people like Shoja, who has a far more greater knowledge in literature, that helped me to also make the right. But maybe Shoja can speak a little bit.
All I could say, if we would have attended this panel, we probably wouldn't have been able to make the film. So it's really like to go through all this info. I mean, it's fantastic. It's, you know, I'm learning a lot, but a lot of our work is simply crude. You know, it's gut feeling. You know, seeing images, as you mentioned. You know, relating to things and just actually doing it. I think the difference is, you know, you do and you learn. And that's really the core of art making, I guess. I guess at the beginning it was action, right? So, so that's the core of it. But I think, you know, I mean, I like among people that probably have influenced me since childhood. One of them is Rumi. I know many of his poems by heart, but also, you know, many other poets and you know, pieces of literature and visual vocabulary and all of that we have come across. And you really don't know when and how they enter the work. It's not a conscious decision, let's go pick like a Rumi poem. It just enters somehow, you know. And when it enters, it's really, then it is, I think you look for the truth of the work. You know, it has to feel right. It has to sit right. You know, it's really, there is no way to say that you analyze it and you realize, okay, this poem would go really well because it deals with the idea of you know, dialectics of Hegel or not, but it just feels right. It just feels that it sits right within the puzzle that you're trying to yeah.
I just want to end by saying that it's an interesting process that I am at now. My job is to create a mood book for the current film, at least a section of it. And I've tried very hard. Like, I created a mood book for this film, and I collected images from the Man Ray, the blurry shots that he had in his films, to Maya Deren, to all kinds of different places. Fellini, and anyway, but now I'm due to make a mood book that sort of creates for the producers to finance it, how the film would visually look like. What should they expect? It's like in 3 minutes. And they're asking me, because in the script it says, then we have this music montage, and then we see the people fall into the state of ecstasy, and then we leave reality, blah, 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 blah. And so they said, okay, can you show this to us? And these last few days, and it's a really interesting challenge. I'm trying to create first some storyboard for myself, bringing images from different places. I've been talking to musicians about, how do they feel when they're actually high, sort of intoxicated by music, and trying for my own sake imagine what the film would look like, and then go after shooting something, maybe bring in some archival footage. But it's really difficult because I have to rely back to my own imagination.
You just have to think of what would appeal to producers and mine.
Yeah.
We can't end with that show, Jen. It can't be the last one.
Well, they're expecting the opposite. So what I'm saying is that the artist goes back to that rawness of the imagination, where you write all you want, but you have to give it an image. And that's very challenging, and I'm having a hard time, like this. But it's also, that's really the most creative part, where you begin to see the film come alive. Anyway, it's been a...
Well, you do it so well.
Not always. I think they like us to end. It's 6:10. Thank you for your very attentive audience.